privilege to introduce next two keynote speakers. Some of you may already heard about them. Some of you may even have already seen them. Both have a lot of in common. They share the same first name. Both of them have a German roots. By the way, one of them is a German. Yes, that's true. But mostly, both of them are great AGE experts who knows the importance of patients' advocacy. Also, they know what does taking control of AGE means. And I have just recently found out that they can predict the future. From US AGEA Hereditary Angioedema Center at University California, San Diego, and from Charité University Hospital in Berlin, Germany. Warmly welcome Professor Marc Riedl and Professor Markus Magerl.
Well, thank you, Magerl, for that fabulous introduction. So we're in the home stretch, and it's at the end of a long 2 days, a good 2 days, I hope, very informative. And so to sort of bring it home, Markus and I were asked to talk about taking control of HAE now and in the future. So we're going to try to keep it interesting for you, try to keep you from snoozing here. Some of what we're going to say you've heard, but that's all right. We're going to try to summarize a number of things in practical terms that will be useful to you. And then mostly Markus is going to glimpse into the future. So he's actually has that talent more than I. So, but in the event of, or in the spirit of keeping everyone awake, I want to start with this. So being in Vienna, you might think that this is Beethoven and Mozart, but oh no, look closely. These are our fearless leaders, Tony Castaldo and Henrik Boysen, and I want to start by thanking them very much for their insight. They've composed and conducted this conference with incredible expertise, and I know they have a whole team behind them. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to put everyone's face up here, but let's just give them a round of applause for putting on this conference. All right, so I'm going to start with a short story. As I was thinking about the theme this year, Take Control of HAE, I kept coming back to this woman that I know. And so this is Mildred. That's not her real name, but that's okay. It's not her real picture either, but Mildred is a real person that I know, a lovely woman. She's 80 years young. And I've known Mildred for about 2 years or so. She's had a very interesting life. She grew up in a military family in the United States, and those of you from the U.S. know there's a lot of travel involved with military families. They relocate every so often. So she had been in Northern California to Southern California to Oklahoma to Texas to Florida to Washington, D.C. to Chicago, and was living in the upper Midwest at the time that I met her. Mildred started swelling when she was about 13 years old. And she spent a lot of her teenage years and early adult years in and out of the hospital, going to doctors, and continued to swell. And at some point, she got tired of hospitals and basically stopped going unless she was really sick or couldn't breathe. So she was sort of toughing out most of her symptoms. She went on to have an amazing life. And those of you who know, if you ever get the chance to talk to somebody 80 years old, sit and listen, because they have incredible stories. They've lived a long, interesting life in almost every case. So she had gotten caught up in some riots during civil unrest in the United States. She had actually escaped from a burning building where she had to rescue her husband from this burning building. And of course, she had a family. She had a daughter and grandchildren and all the joys and sorrows that go along with that. what I haven't told you is that Mildred was diagnosed with HAE at age 78. So she spent most of her life having this condition, not having any idea what it was, and no one could really help her. And so that being said, I asked her recently, after all she's been, I said, what's the most difficult thing that you've been through? What's been the hardest part of this long life that you've led? And she paused for a second, and then she looked right in my eye and said, I really hated living in Oklahoma. Is there anyone here from Oklahoma? Okay, I'm not picking on Oklahoma. In fact, I grew up in Missouri, very near Oklahoma, so there's nothing wrong with Oklahoma, but she really disliked that. And I was surprised at her answer. Of course, there's not much to look at in Oklahoma. There's a picture of Oklahoma. But I was shocked. This woman had been through hell. I said, Mildred, I'm surprised. All the health problems you've had, all the emergency room visits. She said, yeah, but you know what? I'm in control now. I have medicine that works. I know how to use it. I know where to get help. I still respect my HAE, but I'm not afraid of it anymore. And so I took two things from that. One is we got to do a better job at diagnosing people, right? We got to catch them earlier than this. But the second thing was that it's never too late to take control. And she has, and she lives a very active life. She travels all over. Anyway, so I kept coming back to that story, and I wanted to share that with you. So as we sort of summarize some things we've talked about this weekend, I first want to point out now and in the future, we have to do a better job of diagnosing. We still have problems with this. I was actually encouraged to hear Andreas Zanichelli yesterday share some data. We're doing better. If you look at big data sets, we're actually shrinking the time to diagnosis, but it's still not great. And you guys have seen this list a million times probably. These are all different types of angioedema and different causes of angioedema. The ones in the red box are the ones that we think are mostly caused by bradykinin, so the non-allergic types, with the exception of the idiopathic histaminergic. But you can appreciate the complexity. We have to work through these things, and a lot of doctors don't know about how to think about this or test for it. And then there's this big group at the bottom, which is idiopathic, which we've been talking about a little bit. We don't know what causes a lot of the angioedema cases we see. We know misdiagnosis remains a problem. This is, again, from a group of European researchers. Again, Andreas is the lead author on this, showing the issues with misdiagnosis, that 44% in this group had a misdiagnosis before they got the correct diagnosis of HAE. And unfortunately, if you get a misdiagnosis, your delay in getting the correct diagnosis goes up to an average of about 13 years. So if you miss it the first few times, then that's what happened to Mildred. They kept missing it, and then she stopped going, basically. So you can see, and these will be familiar to you, most people diagnosed with allergies or abdominal problems. And here's the truth of the matter. I'm sure you've gotten the gist of it this weekend. First of all, we don't know when people walk in what's causing the swelling. And most people, truthfully, in the world out there, most people do have an allergy problem. So that's what doctors think of. And they neglect the other side of this chart, which is the bradykinin pathway. We rely a lot on the clinical history. And so it's important that someone listens to your symptoms, listens to the responses you've had to treatment. Because at the end of the day, the number of tests we actually have to diagnose these conditions is pretty limited. C1 inhibitor, of course, we need to be doing that testing. Didn't show up right, but a factor 12 mutation. And then we have these new mutations that have just been described in the last year or two. So we're getting better at diagnosing, but we would recognize that there's still this big group of people that either spend time up here in the question mark because no one knows what test to send, or fall into this idiopathic category. And idiopathic can actually be either histamine or bradykinin. So this is where it gets tough and frustrating, and we really have to look at the response to treatment. And we want to do better there. In the future, we're hoping, as you've heard this weekend, we're working on tests that will give us the answer to this. Is it bradykinin or is it histamine, so that you don't have to go through all these trials of medications to see, does it help you or not? But so that's the now, and hopefully the future, this will look different. We'll have better tests to sort out more quickly who has these various subtypes of either hereditary angioedema or idiopathic bradykinin or non-histaminergic angioedema. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Markus, who's going to talk a little bit more about HAE with normal C1 inhibitor.
Marc was talking about complexity and of this matter, of this topic. And I think in parts responsible for this complexity is that we learn more about HAE type 3 or HAE with normal C1 inhibitor. To diagnose HAE with normal C1 inhibitor, there we need three things. The one thing is the patient is required to have symptoms like HAE type 1 or type 2. The second is these symptoms are going along with normal C1 inhibitor values. If not, he had a type 1, type 2 HAE. And it's required that the patient has a family history. That means that other patients in his family are affected, or we can have a lab test for a factor 12 mutation. If we look a little bit closer, symptoms like HAE type 1, type 2, if we look at the patients with hereditary angioedema with normal C1 inhibitor, we see that the symptoms might differ. So I don't think that the symptoms are really the same. So it's hard. A single attack looks absolutely like an attack of HAE with C1 inhibitor deficiency. However, if you look at the cause and the frequency of the attacks, you see differences. For example, you see here this, no pointer? No pointer, sorry. You see in the middle, you see HAE type 1, type 2. On the right hand, you see hereditary angioedema with normal C1 inhibitor. In HAE with C1 inhibitor deficiency, male and female have the same proportion. In normal C1 inhibitor, female are much more frequent affected of this disease. Facial swellings are frequent in HAE type 1, type 2, but extremely frequent in HAE with normal C1 inhibitor. Tongue swellings that occasionally happens in patients with HAE type 1, type 2, but it's very frequent in HAE with normal C1 inhibitor. All the matter with the prodromes, the feeling that an attack is arising hours before the actual attack is coming, that's particularly seen in HAE with C1 inhibitor deficiency, but very rarely in patients with normal C1 inhibitor. And on the other side, age of onset is 12 years and 26 years. So there are big differences in clinic, in course of the disease. Especially the response to treatment. We talked a little bit the last hour about treatment of HAE with normal C1 inhibitor. Non-responders to C1 inhibitor treatment or non-responders to icatibant treatment, that's extremely rare in HAE type 1, type 2. It's a matter of dose, and virtually all patients respond in an attack to C1 inhibitor or icatibant. However, the response to the therapy is very inconsistent in patients with C1 and with HAE with normal C1 inhibitor. Some patients benefit, others don't. Tranexamic acid can be used, but not for all patients. In a low dose, we heard some respond to a low doses, so that makes me think that it's not that easy that you can count HAE type 1, type 2, type 3, and maybe we detect type 4, type 5. That's not all the same. I think that type 3 is different, is something completely different. It looks alike. If we look in that type 3, we don't compare now HAE with C1 inhibitor and with normal C1 inhibitor. We just look into the patients with normal C1 inhibitor. We see that patients with a mutation behave differently than patients without a mutation. This is a picture about the onset of the symptoms, and we see there is a peak in the patients with a mutation, with a factor 12 mutation, we see a peak between 16 and 20 years of age. An early onset is very rare, a late onset is extremely rare, and we see a clear figure with a time window of onset. We don't see this window in the population with normal C1 inhibitor without the mutation. We see it's completely unclear. It seems to be in the first half of the life, but it can happen all the time, and that's not clear answer. And that makes me think that there's more behind. I try to show it in this graph. On the one hand, we have type 1, type 2, that's the blue one. That's quite clear, that's well defined. That, I don't think, won't change in the next years. But the type 3 looks here as an orange, color orange, but I think we have to split it into different mutations. The best known mutation is factor 12 mutation, and if we talked in the last years about normal C1 inhibitor and the mutation, we were talking about the factor 12 mutation, and obviously these patients with a factor 12 mutation behave different of the other patients with unknown mutation. However, in the last year, 2 new mutations were detected, and these 2 new mutations are in a completely different gene. They are not located in factor 12, they are located in the plasminogen gene, and they are located in the angiopoietin gene. This is far away from all we believed that it had to do with angioedema. And I think that these patients are not fully characterized what they have, but I'm quite sure they are single entities, single diseases, looking like AJE, but they are special type, they are own disease. And so I think that all these still unknown patients will, step by step, it will be discovered, and it will turn out, I think it will turn out, that many other causes, many other mutations, or who knows what else we detect, but I don't think that this is a uniform population. I think many subgroups will be discovered in the next years. And the more it's difficult as these mutations are outside of the expected kinin system, especially plasminogen, angiopoietin. They don't directly interfere with all the molecules we know, well characterized for hereditary angioedema type 1, type 2. They don't affect directly bradykinin or kallikrein or so on. They have indirect effects, or maybe they don't have effects we will detect in the future, and especially the still to discover mutations and causes. I think these must not be part of the kinin cascade we know and we have well characterized, and that explains why so many patients with AJE with normal C1 inhibitor do not respond in a uniform way to our treatment, that we have so many non-responders because maybe the bradykinin is not involved or only indirectly involved, and that's may try to answer. For your question, you got a clear no. It's impossible to answer your question. So it's still a no, but it's a friendly no with a lot of slides and trying to explain that it's really complicated. And so my conclusion for this is, I think that hereditary angioedema with normal C1 inhibitor is not only one disease, is more than one disease. There are subgroups, they are really specialized. These types are different in the underlying cause, in symptoms, and in the course of the disease. Sometimes, some of these types respond, at least partially, to the medications we know. Others do not. Maybe we have to find complete new other medications, and therefore a clear and valid statement. What is HAE type 3? Does this help or not? Should I do or not? That's absolutely impossible, because the variety of these types of HAE is too large to give a simple and valid answer.
Thank you, Marcus. So let's move to treatment now. And this is my attempt to sort of go back to what Henrik and Tony were talking about at the opening, which is level the playing field, right? Now, I played a lot of soccer or football in my younger years. I don't know about this field. This looks tough. Creative, but tough. And so when we talk about treatment, I think we do have to first recognize that there is a lot of differences between what's available in our respective countries and what choices we have. So we clearly have global differences in how HAE is managed, and that's something that we want to work on in the future. And this isn't going to be easy, of course. We're up against a number of factors, including regulatory factors in each country or region, as well as payer factors. Who's going to cover the medications that we need to manage HAE? So this is just sort of another call to action. It was tremendous to hear yesterday and today all the local and regional activities that are going on, because that's what it's going to take. It's going to take you all, it's going to take the physicians, it's going to take legislators and the HAEI to move the needle on this so that we actually can level the playing field and start to treat HAE. We'd like to treat it the same everywhere. That's really how it should be with effective medications. So I just want to remind people that we do have studies demonstrating the impact of these therapies. It's been done in part in countries in Europe. It's been done to some extent in the United States, where we've measured before and after access to these effective medications. So what's clearly obvious to all of you who are affected by this, we have data to support this, and that's going to be important moving forward. I heard earlier that I think it was in Japan or other countries, if we can gather that data now and then show as access becomes better to medications, it's a golden opportunity to really show how important these drugs are. So again, action now, collecting data, will help us in the future to fight this battle and gain access to effective treatments. And then I'll talk about this in a moment, but self-administration, I think this is the other really important point for managing HAE, is as much as possible, when allowed and when patients are comfortable, that they treat themselves. We have, again, we have several studies now showing that this works better. It's better if you have the medicine and can use it rather than having to travel somewhere to get it. Better outcomes, better quality of life. So these are just some guiding principles. So let's talk a little bit about management. This is the French author that wrote The Little Prince. I don't know if anybody's read that. It's like the 4th best-selling book in the world, translated to more than 300 languages. But I like this saying, a goal without a plan is just a wish. We have to plan to make sure that treatment works the way it's supposed to. And so some years ago, Dr. Zura invited me to write a chapter for a book on a comprehensive treatment plan for hereditary angioedema. So I diligently sat down and started writing out all the things that need to happen for us to get a plan that works. And you're not supposed to be able to read this. I mean, that's the point. There's a lot of stuff that has to be done to make these treatment plans work, from getting the right diagnosis to choosing a medication that's going to work, talking about the risks and benefits, and on and on and on. And then there's all the follow-up that needs to happen to monitor for side effects, make sure the plan's working, make adjustments. So the point is that this is complicated, and we have to work together to make sure that this works well. And this is where I think it's very important, to, as much as you can, to have an expert in HAE involved in your care. This is something that's in our U.S. recommendations for HAE management. It's alluded to or mentioned in all of the consensus documents that have been put together around the world. And I think it is very important. Now, again, you may not have, not every country may have a center. A lot of the countries here do have a center, and I would encourage people to get there if you're having difficulty with either the diagnosis or the management of HAE. But certainly, as we've talked about, we've heard from several people, if you can just find one physician that's interested and knowledgeable, that goes a long, long way. Someone that can collaborate with your local physicians who knows all of the treatment options, the risks and benefits, and help guide you through those choices, that's a very, very important component to this. And as we all know, this is a condition that changes over time. I tell my patients it has a mind of its own. It will act up, it will quiet down. You may have times that are very good and times that are not so good. So being able to work with someone dynamically to change over time, that's another important point, and important to have an expert involved. And so this is, way too general practitioner. It could be anything. That's not really what you want. Although, again, I know some family doctors and internists and family and pediatricians who are very, very good at managing HAE because they have an interest in it and they're willing to learn it. Now, this is also to remind me of just a quick pearl, and I've talked with a few of you over the course of the weekend. Not everything that goes wrong is HAE, right? And this is a trap that happens sometimes, that every symptom, every medical problem that comes up, you or often your doctors will say, oh, it must be your HAE. No, you're allowed to have other medical problems, and in fact, a lot of people do. The human body's complicated. So just be careful. It's always important to think of other things besides HAE. We can't get tunnel vision, but you need somebody to sort of help sort out what's due to HAE and what's due to other things that need to be addressed. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the therapy now, and then Markus is going to talk about therapy in the future. I'm not going to cover all these drugs in detail. The only reason I show you this is to remind you of what you already know. In the last decade, there's been a real uptick in the amount of research for treatment in HAE. So you can see how slowly things progressed from the 1960s until about 2008, 2009. And now we have this rapid increase in the number of treatments that have been studied. And as you'll see when Markus talks, it hasn't slowed down. There's in fact many new things coming down the pipeline. Because it's become more complicated in a good way, we have more options that we can potentially use to treat HAE. We also have a proliferation of evidence-based guidelines. There's 5 of them listed here, and the good news is they all say very similar things. So any of these are sort of a valid thing to look at as a guiding light in terms of making sure we're treating HAE appropriately and according to the evidence that's out there with the studies. I'm just going to quickly highlight this one because, again, you heard this the first day from Tony and Henrik, but this is the most recent guideline that just was revised. You can see 2018. It was just put out a few months ago. So it's the most sort of up-to-date in terms of looking at the evidence that's out there, the WAO guideline. And so very quickly, we're not going to belabor this. I want you to hear one more time. My favorite mentor ever told me, important things will be repeated, important things will be repeated, important things will be repeated. So you heard this the first day, you're going to hear it again today. But keep these things in mind because as you go back to your respective physicians, communities, countries, this is what we're aiming for. And we know it may not be possible in all places, but this is sort of the guidepost we should try to hit. So all HAE attacks are considered for on-demand treatment, and any attack affecting or potentially affecting the upper airway is treated without a doubt. Now, the percentages after these statements, there was a voting body of HAE specialists that looked at these, discussed these points, and then voted whether they agreed with it. So you're going to see most of the time there's 100% agreement. Where there's not, I'll tell you why that was. HAE attacks are treated as early as possible. Everyone believes that's beneficial. I'll show you a graph on that in a moment. HAE attacks are treated with either C1 inhibitor, a ecallantide, or a icatibant. So the only reason that's not 100% is because there were people on the committee that said, you know what, we don't have that in our country. We can't get that. So don't put that because we can't accomplish that. That was overwhelmed by most of the people who said, you know what, that's the goal though. Even if you can't do it, that's what we should be aiming for. So the sort of, rising tide brings up all ships. We want to bring everyone up to this. We shouldn't be aiming lower. The fourth one, all patients have sufficient medication for on-demand treatment of 2 attacks and carry their on-demand medication at all times. And lastly, all patients who are provided with on-demand treatment licensed for self-administration should be taught to self-administer. And again, there was 100% agreement that if that's possible, that's the way we should be treating these attacks, that you shouldn't have delays in going to wait to get your medication somewhere else. I'm not going to go into these in depth. I just want to remind you that we do have options. These are to treat acute attacks, plasma-derived C1 inhibitor, recombinant C1 inhibitor. In the US, we have a drug called icalentide and then icatibant. And there are differences between these, the route that they're administered, either sub-Q or IV. There are, of course, side effects for any drug, and so there's some differences in those. And of course, there's differences in where these are available in the world based on regulatory bodies in different countries. But be aware of your options, and ideally have a physician that's aware of these options and can sort of go over those with you. But everyone should have, ideally, everyone should have an effective drug to treat an acute attack. And this is just, once again, a reminder that home administration has been shown in several studies now. You can see the references down here at the bottom, and this actually isn't exhaustive. There are a couple of more recent papers, again, confirming that self-administration is beneficial and a better way to go than having to go to the hospital or the clinic. And that's because people get better faster. They have shorter attacks, the severity doesn't get as bad. And when you look at quality of life, which measures, how well are people doing overall, they're better when they're able to administer their medication themselves. The last bullet point is important, of course. The old saying, don't try this at home. Well, we want you to try it at home, but only after you've learned how to do it. So training is important. You don't want to have side effects or complications because you're uncomfortable in the methods for doing home administration. What about prevention or prophylaxis right now, today? So patients are evaluated for long-term prophylaxis at every visit. Disease burden and patient preference should be taken into consideration. So this sounds like not that big of a deal, but this is actually a substantial shift, or at least an emphasis compared to some other guidelines. The fact that long-term prophylaxis should be discussed perhaps at every visit. Meaning that this is an option maybe we should be looking at more carefully as we get better, more effective prophylactic treatments. And then disease burden and patient preference should be taken into consideration. That's important, and that's something that, I mean, we could poll the crowd, but my suspicion is that doesn't always happen. That the patient themselves is asked, what would you like to do? What sounds like it's going to fit best with your treatment approach that you prefer? The use of C1 inhibitor for first-line long-term prophylaxis. So this was perhaps the most controversial of the statements that were agreed upon by this group. You can see there was about 50 to 75% agreement. And that's because, as we talked about, in not every region or country of the world is C1 inhibitor accessible as a prophylactic option. There is a cost associated with that, and so there are cost concerns in many areas for using that as a prophylactic option. However, based on the efficacy and the safety of the medication, that statement did carry the day. The majority thought that, again, that's what we should be aspiring to if it's feasible with resources in a country or a region. And the third statement is similar. Androgens should be used as second-line long-term prophylaxis. Again, it was a bit controversial with the group. It's an effective treatment. It's quite clear that that's the case. This works for some people. However, there are concerns about long-term side effects with the androgens. And so again, it's there, it's an option. The majority of the group felt it maybe should be a second-line option, but we know in many places that's what's available. And so it is in the guidelines as an option for prophylaxis. Suggesting an adaptation of long-term prophylaxis in terms of dosage or treatment interval as needed to minimize burden of disease. This basically says you have to look at this in follow-up, right? Do you still want to be on prophylaxis? Do you still need prophylaxis? If you're using it, do we need to adjust the dose up or down based on how your symptoms are doing? And so this is what we all know, that HAE is not a static condition. It changes over time, and we have to adjust our treatment plan along with that. These are just a table of the prophylactic drugs. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, But there's the intravenous plasma-derived C1 inhibitor, the attenuated androgens, and the antifibrinolytics like tranexamic acid, which, as you've heard, I think, a couple of times today, tranexamic acid is clearly less effective than these other options for type 1 and type 2 HAE, but likely plays an important role in HAE with normal C1 inhibitor, where it actually appears to be more effective than some of these other options. So that is an important consideration. Now, the second line down is plasma-derived C1 inhibitor subcutaneous. And I'm going to show you a little bit of data on that. This is available, was recently approved in the United States. I believe this may, over time, become available in other parts of the world. And it's an important advance because of the efficacy, which I'll show you in just a second. Now, what have we learned about C1 inhibitor? Because that's sort of been bumped up as a preferred prophylactic option. This is the IV C1 inhibitor data that was published some years ago, 2010. And what we saw in that study was that at a dose of 1,000 units twice a week, there was about a 50% reduction on average in the number of attacks that people had compared to placebo. We've learned a little bit since then. We've learned that if you increase the dose, that you can actually bring down the attack rate for a number of people who didn't see much of an impact with that 1,000 units twice a week. So not surprisingly, this is not a one dose fits all, at least for this mode of therapy. And this is there sometimes may be dose adjustments that are necessary. But perhaps what has made a bigger impact recently, this is the subcutaneous C1 inhibitor trial. And if you focus on the right side of the graph, which is a weight-based dosing, 60 units per kilogram, you can see that compared to placebo, people have many fewer attacks. In fact, on a median, which is a statistical way to look at this, it's a 95% reduction. If you look at the average reduction, which is a slightly different way to calculate it, it's about 84% reduction in attacks. So this appears to be more effective than the intravenous route that was used previously. It is a higher dose, but because it keeps a steadier level in the bloodstream, we think this has better preventative effects. And so this is a therapy that we are making use of now in the United States, and we hope will be available in other parts of the world in the not too distant future. Importantly, I want to point out, because we start to talk about a lot of numbers, this is quality of life data from that same study with subcutaneous C1 inhibitor. And this is increasingly being incorporated into clinical trials now. We want to know not only does it stop your attacks for prevention, but does it actually improve your quality of life? Because at the end of the day, that's the most important. And I'll point out the most impressive things are perhaps anxiety. People's anxiety improved. Anything to the right of that vertical line is an improvement. And then work productivity was much greater in people that were getting the treatment compared to placebo. So it appears not only are we reducing attacks, but that translates to people feeling better, having less anxiety and depression, and actually being more productive in their work and the other aspects of their life. And then lastly, this is recombinant C1 inhibitor. This is not approved for prophylaxis. This is still only approved for acute medication, but there was a study showing that this does work prophylactically to prevent attacks. You can see about a 72% reduction with twice weekly dosing IV. And this may be important because of availability. We know that plasma-derived C1 inhibitors, there are occasionally shortages that were mentioned in the question and answer. Recombinant C1 inhibitor production is sort of abundantly available. So this may be something that if approved for prophylaxis, would be more widely available to around the globe. And lastly, I'll just point out, we've talked about this, but for HAE with normal C1 inhibitor, we don't have these same rigorous trials that we have for C1 inhibitor deficiency. We do have case reports, publications documenting that these medicines I've just mentioned do work, either acutely or prophylactically in some patients with HAE with normal C1 inhibitor. But as you heard from Markus, it's likely that this is a grab bag of different conditions, and not everyone diagnosed with this responds well to these particular medications. This is a transition slide, but I'm writing you a prescription. Do you want a longer life with less quality, or vice versa? Well, we don't have to choose. We don't want to choose, right? We want it all. So that's the point of trying to work closely, pick the drug that works best for you with the least amount of side effects, and you have to follow up periodically to make sure that things stay effective and safe. So here's my pointers for you in terms of treatment. Treat any or all attacks that interfere with your usual activities if you have the capability to do that. Treat early. And I've talked about this already, but self-administration is important. Seek medical attention if your airway is affected. I worry a lot as we've gotten more effective treatments. We have people sitting at home sometimes with airway attacks. And I've learned to bargain and negotiate with people. I know you don't want to go to the hospital, so do me a favor, go to the coffee shop right next to the hospital and wait there and make sure that you get better, because waiting until your airway is closing is not the time to decide, oh no, I need to be at the hospital. So be very careful about airway attacks. Being too cavalier about that is when real tragedies happen. All right, this is actually Marcus's slide. I asked him if I could borrow it. You remember that, Marcus?
Oh, yes.
Okay. He's looking blankly like, hey, I'm not sure, yeah. So I just want to show early treatment is important, and this is why. As the swelling takes place, the severity is, of course, the upward slope hitting the peak, usually within several hours, or that could take up to 24 hours, sometimes faster. But over time, it gradually gets worse. If you wait and treat, say, 12 or 24 hours into the attack, you really don't improve things that much, because all you're doing is stopping more swelling. You're not pushing the fluid back into the vasculature. Whatever's there is going to take time to go back down. If you treat a little earlier, now at least you've reduced the time that you're swollen, because there's less fluid theoretically that needs to be reabsorbed. And ideally, if you treat very early, you can stop both the severity from progressing, and that little bit of fluid that has gotten out won't take quite so long to go back into the vasculature. So this is sort of a schematic representation, but this has been shown in studies. Shorter time of swelling, less severity when you treat early. And this is why we don't want people to wait and see how bad it gets before they use their medication. This is, again, assuming that you have access to an effective medicine, which is very, very important. All right, last couple of tips here. Keep track of your symptoms. We think this is increasingly important, not only for your medical care, but also as we continue to fight for access for medications. We need to be as accountable as possible for how these are being used, why they're being used, and that way we can document that it's important to have these medications. And then work with your specialist if you're not getting your medication as quickly as you need it, if the treatment's ineffective, you're getting side effects, or if you have major surgeries. And the cartoon on the right, you probably already read, how can I trust your information when you're using such outdated technology of pen and paper, right? There's all these apps now. Increasingly, we're sort of working in real time with feedback, and I think technology may be a tool we can use, but good old pen and paper still works also. This was mentioned. I think emergency treatment plans and cards are very important. This is the one that's available through the US HAEA, but as we discussed, it's likely that you can get this through your local chapter or HAEI as well. This is part of what we hand out at our center, which includes, as you can see, the treatments that are available, and we try to tailor this to each patient based on what medicine they're using and what works best for them. There's also a website here, the HAEA website in the US, which has all kinds of educational information for a physician. If you come in and give them to this, they can log on and quickly learn a lot about HAE in a very short period of time. So, I've talked about the things in the middle here. I'm going to hand it over to Markus to talk about all the action that's happening for the future, which are the large red rings around the outside. Sir.
Thank you. So, a wise man, I'm more interested in the future than in the past, because the future is where I intend to live. Who am I not to agree to Albert Einstein? So I agree to him fully. However, I think it's sometimes a little bit helpful to look into the past. Just 2 or 3 slides into the past. This is the original of the first description of a hereditary angioedema. And this was done by Dr. Quinke in Kiel, and he described the first time the disease hereditary angioedema. It was in 1882. And he was not describing only, but he also made some suggestions how to treat it. And his suggestion was a regulation of way of life, in particular the digestion for prophylaxis. And in 1882, he recommended attacks could be shortened by resting, foot baths, purging the bowels. And a last recommendation was atropine seems to be beneficial. So we left some of these recommendations. However, his doctoral student, Eugen Dinkelacker, he had more patients with this disease and with other kind of angioedema, and he made his own thoughts, and he recommended, beyond what Quinke suggested, beyond resting, foot bath, and purging the bowels, Dinkelacker recommends therapy should focus on activity of the vasomotoric nerves. Studies should be done with atropine, ergotine, electricity, and others. So there's a grain of truth in it. So he was talking about the vasomotoric nerves, and for many years it was called angioneurotic edema because it was thought the nerves would play a role. That's maybe not so true, but it's true that the vessels play a role and the tightness of the vessels play a role. And it took many, many years until all or most of the pathomechanisms of HAE type 1, type 2 were cleared, that C1 inhibitor was discovered, and finally found that bradykinin is responsible for the swellings. And step by step, the medications were introduced, and Marc was talking about androgens and about antifibrinolytics. It has been introduced fresh frozen plasma to replace C1 inhibitor, and Marc told that C1 inhibitor was introduced in 1979 to replace. That's what we have at the moment, and additionally in the last years we became icatibant and the US ecallantide. So we have lots of drugs working in different points of this cascade, and that should make us happy. But I think there are more ideas, better drugs or other drugs with other additional benefits appearing on the horizon, and I'd like to tell you what we will face if things go well in the next years. The one we will see is a product of the company called Shire. They developed a subcutaneous C1 inhibitor. I think it's a little bit comparable to Garda, what's available in the US. It's a reduced, volume reduced formulation. Only a few milliliters need to be injected subcutaneously, 2,000 units twice a week. And there was a big study investigating how patients respond to that treatment over 14 weeks. And it has been shown that the number of attacks is greatly reduced in these patients. So on the left side, we have the placebo control, that's 100%, and the others, they had a reduction of more than 80% of the attacks. So a subcutaneous application of C1 inhibitor seems to be a good idea, a well-tolerated and effective idea to treat HAE attacks. And in the same study, it could be seen that the number of patients in this 14-week treatment interval was almost 40%. 40% of the patients had no attack in this time frame. So that's a quite a positive message from this study. I'm not sure when it will be licensed or brought to market. There are some ideas, some rumors that it could be the case in 2018 or maybe 2019. It will take a while, but I think most of you here in the room will have this option in the future. Another idea is to block the kallikrein. Kallikrein is a central point in the cascade to produce bradykinin. If kallikrein is blocked, almost no bradykinin can be produced. And this works in this study. It's an idea from a company called Diex, now Shire. They used an antibody. An antibody is a protein that is programmed to find a molecule, to catch it, to hold it, and to inactivate it. And the benefit of an antibody is it has a long half-life. And this has a half-life of almost 20 days. And so I'd like to present sparse data about the study. I think the study will be published in the next weeks, and only then you will see all the data. But what I am allowed to tell is it was a phase 3 study, 125 patients, so that's really a big number. Half a year of treatment period, so it's a remarkable time that is evaluated. The age of these patients were 12 years or older, and the patients got 150 milligrams or 300 milligrams every 4 weeks or every 2 weeks against placebo. And again, we see a huge reduction under the drug in the investigational medicinal product when the patients got this compared to placebo. We have more than 80% of reductions, almost 90% of reduction compared to placebo. A big number of patients was completely symptom-free, and the side effects, that was really very, very low. We saw no severe side effects which are causative by the drug. And the FDA in the US and the EMA in Europe, these are the agencies, the government agency who are responsible for the licensing of the drug. They have seen that it's obviously working quite good, and both promised to make a fast decision, so we expect an answer if the drug is licensed in the US and in Europe in August or September in Europe. The idea with the antibodies is not completely new, and so another company, CSL Behring, had the idea to make an antibody as well, but not against kallikrein, but against factor 12. Factor 12, you see, is a central molecule as well as kallikrein, and kallikrein and factor 12, they need each other to be activated properly. And without factor 12, kallikrein cannot work properly. So blocking factor 12 seems to be a good idea as well. And to block factor 12A, the activated factor 12, that's the idea of CSL. They are starting with a phase 2 study in this year, later this year, and I think it will take some time. But it will take some time until we will see the results. But the idea seems to be very good. You may have heard, or maybe yourself, part of the studies with the new oral prophylactic medication, kallikrein inhibitors. Is there anybody here who took part in the oral studies? Some of you, not too much. too many. It's a designed molecule, and this designed molecule is blocking the kallikrein in a classical pharmacological way. And there were some studies in the past, and these studies showed that it's dose-dependent, in parts, dose-dependent response when the patients get this medication, and the number of attacks is greatly reduced versus placebo if the dose is correct. So the lowest dose on the right side doesn't seem to work properly, and however, the highest doses on the left side are not as good as the obvious ideal dose of 125 milligrams. So 1 tablet a day with 125 milligrams, that is obviously the best dose, and this dose is further investigated. Here another, you see the violet is placebo, the light green is the lowest dose, and the darker it is, the higher the dose is. And you see the light green has the highest bars, the 125 milligrams. It has the highest effect in these patients. These are the patients who are completely symptom-free. It's only a short treatment interval, but 50%, almost 50% were symptom-free with the ideal dose of 125 milligrams, and that's why the next studies will use 110 and 150 milligrams. Over there should be the ideal dose, and the studies are ongoing. And if you had a question in the big questions round here, how can I help? I think participating in the study, that would help research and physicians and the other patients to get more and better medications. The same drug might be used for acute attacks as well. It's the same drug, however, this time it's not a tablet given as prophylaxis. This time it's formulated as a liquid, and the patients have to drink a liquid as soon as an attack emerges to see if this drug can be useful as an on-demand treatment as well. Very interesting concept to have an oral on-demand treatment. Imagine how beneficial it would be if this would work in children as well. So that's a great success. And again, I think it deserves to be supported by you in participating in these studies. Another company called Calvista has produced or has developed oral kallikrein inhibitor as well, and it has a high affinity. It obviously will work very well, at least the data we have at the moment. In 2017, phase 1 trial has been set up for prophylactic as well as for acute treatment. You can imagine there is absolutely no data about this, but in the future you will have it. The one thing, interesting kind of therapeutic study is ongoing is from another company called Ionis. They develop antisense RNA. That's a very interesting concept. If the body wants to produce a molecule, wants to produce a protein like kallikrein, or better, pre-kallikrein, the information for pre-kallikrein is saved in the genes. And every time the body wants to produce pre-kallikrein, the gene plan is made a copy from it, and the copy then serves to produce the kallikrein, one protein of kallikrein. And the copy is the blue one. The copy is the blue one, and the blue one finally will process in the ribosomes to produce a molecule of pre-kallikrein. However, the drug is the red one, and the red one is gluing these information, and the information is not longer working. This information can't be read by the ribosome, and that's how this drug is acting. They are working on first studies, but it will take some time. At the end, it will be a subcutaneous injection, but I have no more data about this. It shows that after only 3 weeks of dosing, subjects in the different dosing cohorts displayed a reduction in the prekallikrein function of 33 to 92%. So obviously, there is no study in patients. However, in the blood we can see it seems to work. And one very last, very funny idea of a company called iBio is to produce plants who produce C1 inhibitors. So maybe one day you can have the C1 inhibitor in your garden. I don't know if you can smoke it or not, but so it's a very interesting idea to have it like this. And they take the gene of a C1 inhibitor, and with help of a virus, they put it into the plant. And after a while, the plant is producing a human C1 inhibitor, and you can harvest it, and it's full of C1 inhibitor. So I think what is coming soon is what you in parts have or will have soon is a C1 inhibitor for subcutaneous use for prophylaxis. I think that will be happen in the next years. What will be happen in the next month and year is the antibody against kallikrein called lanadelumab for prophylaxis. I'm quite sure the license will be given because the data is really convincing, and that will be the next new drug in the field. The tablets, the kallikrein antagonisting tablets, that will last a while, but the studies look very good. 2 companies are working on the same concept. That means it's regarded as a very promising drug. The kallikrein liquid for oral use, I think that will last for a few years until we see it, especially if it's licensed for children. That will take some time, but I think the idea is excellent. De facto 12 antibody for prophylaxis, not in 2019 and 2020, but the first studies are going, and we will see how things develops. And the other things, oligonucleotides for prophylaxis and all this stuff, we will see how the future will be. I can't make any predictions. What I can predict is the future drugs focus more on prophylaxis, as the current drugs are doing. And given that the new drugs are well tolerated, as I would expect it, and given that the new drugs are efficient, I think when the new drugs are available, this may change the treatment paradigms. This may change how we advise our patients. Maybe the on-demand treatment steps back, and the prophylaxis will win importance in the treatment of HAE. However, more options mean more room for individualization. So if you have more drugs available, you much more can tailor your treatment for yourself, what fits yourself, what fits in your life, what fits into your skills, and so on. So I think there will be an improvement without any doubt.
So don't go far. I just want to say this was added last minute because you can confirm the rumor. There was a rumor that the kids asked about gene therapy in the youth program today.
They did. The younger kids, not the older.
So to satisfy the children who are asking about gene therapy, smart kids these days, I just want to say one word. There is activity for gene therapy in HAE. Many of us think that this could potentially be the closest thing to a cure that we're talking about. And the idea here is that you can take something called an adeno-associated virus, which is a virus that is generally not harmful to humans. You can make a virus that will transport the human gene that makes C1 inhibitor and carry it into the body where it will integrate to the cells, in this case the liver cells, and that the cells that are transfected with this vector, we call it, this virus, will then start to make the C1 inhibitor. This has been done in mice. This is some work out of Cornell University in New York. It's only been presented in abstract form, so we haven't seen the full data set yet, but it appears that they are able to do this in mice, to take a virus and actually a mouse that doesn't make C1 inhibitor will suddenly start making it at normal levels. There are questions about how safe this is, of course. There are questions about how long this will last once you have this sort of treatment in humans. So there are a lot of unanswered questions, but there is a company moving this forward, talking with the FDA and other regulatory bodies about doing this in humans. And so I think this is something that could potentially be an exciting advance in the future. But again, I think we have to be cautious because we do have very effective medications that will prevent swelling attacks. And the only other thing I'd say about all these advances is, first of all, thank you to any and all of you who have participated in these studies. These things don't happen on their own, right? That you have to have people with these conditions that are interested and willing to participate in studies. And for any of the future advances we've talked about to happen, that has to continue. So, being in a research project is, of course, a very personal decision. There's always risks involved, but that's what has to continue for us to make these sorts of treatments a reality. So I would just encourage you to think about that so we can continue to move the science forward, but more importantly, give people and families with HAE a better life in general. So I'll let you finish up with the control.
Yeah, control. Take control. That is the motto of this event here. Take control of HAE. And that's a great idea. That's a great motto. I like it. But how do you know that your HAE is under control, that the disease is under control? The disease itself doesn't tell it to you. You have to decide when the disease is under control. And to support you and your physician, there has been developed an angioedema control test. This looks very simple. These are only 4 questions for a patient, and the patient is asked to, in the last 3 months, how often have you had angioedema? And the answer probably is very often, sometimes seldom, not at all. That looks very simple, and it's a simplification, because the disease is a very complex thing, and this is a simplification for sure. However, if this is validated in many patients and many other tests are done, this can give to you and to your physician a valuable answer if the disease is under control. The idea to measure disease control first was developed in asthma. The asthma control test was the first to have a questionnaire like this, and it turned out that the asthma control test became the standard tool in the treatment of the patients because this test turned out to be so helpful that the answer, if the therapy should be adapted, this answer could be given by the test. So if the test was good, the therapy had not to be changed, and if the answer was bad, the therapy should be changed. And we have seen the same in the urticaria control test, another disease. It's a very valuable tool, and here now is the angioedema control test. The patient has to answer 4 questions. These 4 questions are: in the last 3 months, how often have you had angioedema? In the last 3 months, how much has your quality of life been affected by angioedema? In the last 3 months, how much has the unpredictability of your angioedema bothered you? And in the last 3 months, how well has your angioedema been controlled by your therapy? These answers then are be calculated. Just sum up the points, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 points, and at the end, the test value will be between 0 and 16, and we still don't know where's the threshold. We're currently calculating the threshold. We expect a threshold between 12 and 14. And when that threshold is established, we can tell later if you have 12 points or more, for example, the disease is well controlled, so there is no urgent issue to change the therapy. Obviously, things are going quite well, and if the point value is below this threshold, the doctor and yourself should think what can be done better. Should there be a change in the treatment to improve the thing? So take control is a great thing, but control can be measured, should be measured, and that may help you. It's translated already in Arabic, Italian, German, and English, and other languages. The translation is in progress, so soon it will be available in your country as well.
And so that brings us full circle to what's most important, and I'll just add that in the future, there's going to be more work looking at quality of life, because that, at the end of the day, that's why any of this matters, that we're actually making a difference in the lives of people that have HAE, in their family lives. And so you can see there's a number, these are very recent papers, and there's more to come. You see familiar names on here. Teresa Caballero, who's sitting up here, has been a real leader in this area. Our very own Henrik Boysen has been working on this as well. So if you have the chance to participate in this sort of research, I really encourage it, because this, at the end of the day, is how we define, are we getting to where we want to be in terms of these sorts of treatments? All right, so the summary, this is what we need, what we're striving for. We need better diagnostic tests. We've talked a lot about that this weekend, particularly for HAE with normal C1 inhibitor. We have a lot of work to do in genetics. As was said, there's no simple answer on the genetics question, but people are hard at work at that. And I think with as sequencing becomes easier and the bioinformatics catch up, I think we will eventually have answers there. And then I think technology is going to obviously play a huge role, whether that's monitoring, or there's some interest, at least in the US, at looking at electronic medical records and trying to look for patterns in order to identify people that are struggling with angioedema, what kind of visits, what kind of medications, and focus on those folks to do a better job of taking care of them. As Marcus said, and I totally agree, I think we're seeing a shift towards preventative treatment. That's where most of the research for management is going. So I do think we're going to increasingly be using prevention more than we have in the past. And it makes sense. Why should you, if you don't want to, why should you have to wait to get sick to be treated, right? There's all kinds of other conditions where we don't treat it that way. We try to prevent the problem. So if we can get there safely and effectively, I think that's what we're aiming to do. And I think the new medicines you heard about hopefully will be safer and more effective. And then I mentioned the cures. Gene therapy is one thing. One could argue that if we get a really good medicine that prevents nearly 100% of attack, maybe that's a medical cure. You have to take the medicine, but you're no longer bothered by the symptoms of HAE. And then one last plug for registries. We've heard a little bit about those this weekend, but these are going to be increasingly important as we ask genetic questions, as we look at whether these drugs are safe over the long term. We need to sort of pool our resources, and there are researchers in this room working on that, so that in each country we can collect data, but we can all put it together at the end of the day and actually have a much more powerful tool to look at some of these questions. So we're going to wrap up. Vienna, the city of art. This is Gustav Klimt, a very famous artist. If you get the chance to see his work, I recommend it. Or go to the opera. I know some people have hit that. That's a fantastic venue. You can also go to Sigmund Freud's museum if you want. I'm not going to talk about Freud because that's not going to go anywhere good. But it does allow me to show you this last cartoon, which I like. I'm becoming predictable. I knew you were going to say that. And my point is that this is actually my wish for HAE, is that we make it predictable. We make it predictably quiet. We make it predictably symptom-free. We make your lives predictably normal. And I put that in quotes because I don't know what normal is. But whatever you want it to be, we want to lend that predictability to your life and take away a lot of the burden of this condition. So with that, I think we will finish, take control of HAE, and please do enjoy Vienna. Markus, thank you very much for your contribution.
Thanks to you. Thanks to you. My pleasure.